Hello, welcome to the first Intent-Based Leadership International podcast. I'm Peter and I'm joined today by Nick. Hello, Nick.
Hello.
So we're going to be exploring a number of different elements of what it means to use intent-based leadership, what it means to be an intent-based leader. We're going to cover different principles and practices, and we're going to share some examples of how organizations have applied and had an impact of using this great approach of intent-based leadership. Now, today we're going to start off by looking at the principle of pushing authority to information.
So that sounds good. Why are we starting here?
Well, I guess we would look at it from a strategic perspective, that when an organization chooses to embrace an intent-based leadership approach, there has to be a business rationale behind it. And for me, the business rationale of pushing authority to information is we think that we can operate better as a business if we have decision-making being made closer to the people doing the work. What's your perspective?
I mean, ultimately, any work, people need to understand the why to what they do, but they also need to feel a sense of agency and feel that what they experience on the ground and all the insight that they pick up from doing the work is actually factored into decision making, and that's so often not the case.
So there's an element there which is about what it means from an employee and an ownership and an agency perspective. Thinking about it from the business perspective, what is it that we hear around the rationale that businesses make the decision to say we think that we think that we will be better off if we approach this is a better way to achieve our objectives? What do you hear when people talk about that? What's their rationale?
So they know they're not, often it can be led by customer loyalty or retention issues. They know there's something wrong with the customer experience. It can also come from an innovation agenda where they want to get better thinking quicker and are feeling that they're not getting that or that they're having to hold a lot of the solutions. It's a whole host of reasons. But ultimately, what we often find is that there's a sense that somehow if we just go and do something with our people, that will make all the difference, because it also has to start from the top and it has to be enabled from the top.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're noticing now is that organizations are recognizing that the old traditional approach or the traditional top-down approach is completely outdated, and that if you're operating in an environment where certainly there's any expectation from a customer's perspective of being responsive, having people who have a can-think attitude, not just a can-do attitude, and having people who really care about what they do, then there needs to be a different way of working. Because I think it's easy for us all to come up with those examples of the experience that we've had as customers with people for whom actually that whole idea of having authority seems to be an anathema, or I think it's being taken away. I can think of some recent examples of that. Again, what's your perspective on that, Nick?
We work in the public sector, we work in education, we work medical, we work in utilities, a lot of places where there's actually high regulation, but at the same time, the need to drive faster decisions, where there's been setbacks, accidents, safety issues, where they want people to take more ownership and thinking as things happen and not waiting to be told, because sometimes things happen too quickly. There's a whole host of, you can look at it from a safety and risk angle, you can look at it from an innovation angle, from a customer retention angle, for how you hit new markets and develop new products. But equally, I spent time in retail, and often a lot of it in retail is around trying to reduce the escalation of complaints to more senior levels of management, wanting people to be more responsive and being able to deal with things when they happen with the customer, not being fed through a system and a hierarchy, because you want to feel that you're getting attentive service, that someone understands you and that you're not lost in a process, which I often feel in my operations role here with all the portals I have to log into with people who read off a script or where you're lost in a workflow that's not working for what you specifically need. It, the list goes on.
I think we can all think of examples of where organizations attempts to use tech and to modernize and to drive efficiency ultimately ends up disempowering and taking authority away. I'll give you a recent example. Going into our bank that we'd moved to, so we deliberately moved from a startup bank to a high street bank, a main street bank. And I had a simple request, which was I just needed a letter from the bank confirming that we had an account with that bank. Well, it took me 90 minutes because the person who I was working with did not have the authority to issue a simple letter with our name on it, the name of our business on it. And I was incredulous. And the system had been designed in a way to take authority away from people at the front line. And it ends up just hugely frustrating everyone. And I felt sorry for this guy because he could see that I was incredibly frustrated of a task that I think 5 years ago would have taken 5 minutes to complete. In the end, by kind of working the system a little bit, they found a solution. 90 minutes to get one single letter with 3 lines on it. It was astonishing. But I think that that's not an untypical outcome when we see organizations thinking, oh yeah, well, tech is the answer here. We're going to we're going to put all the power in the process and not in the people.
I think one of the things we talk a lot about is process and plans are incredibly important, but they can only work if they're focused on the outcome you're trying to create. So the commercial outcomes, the customer outcomes. And so often people can get too task focused, and that inability to stop and to think about what they're seeing, how close are we to what we're actually trying to achieve, and what do we need to do to adapt, stop the clock, stop the train, and adapt. So great people can often compensate for poor process, but great process can also very rarely compensates for a poor attitude or poor responsiveness or ability to answer people's problems. And I think that's the dynamic or the tension that companies are facing. And if I think of, interestingly, I saw some parallels between having never worked in a power and energy background before intent-based leadership. I actually found huge parallels from working in retail because they are regulated. There's a lot of health and safety in retail. And then you've got different safety, but highly regulated areas within power and utilities. But actually some of it was the same because it's about how do you get people to follow process, the process that really counts in terms of creating excellent execution and making sure that you're compliant. And so that is much more a linear process. But at the same time, you want them to use their intuition and use their knowledge of the customer and adapt and be able to adapt to different situations. And that can be difficult at times. There was similar tensions in two very completely different areas. Is to how do you maintain compliance about the things that are absolutely fundamental and at the same time enable people to use their thinking in the areas where it really counts in terms of business outcomes and the customer.
Yeah, I think that sense of what we might call the creeping compliance, which means that the approach that you need to take to the really critical safety elements then becomes applied to every single decision, is something that we see a lot in different organizations. I mean, one of the things I'm struck by, having moved from Europe to the United States, is that even from a experience of airlines, I see a difference where it feels in the States that the focus and the purpose of the people working on the gate is genuinely, how do I help you get home, or how do I help you get to the next destination? Whereas in the UK and in Europe, it's largely stuck in that, well, we're flying a plane from A to B and you're a bit of a nuisance if you want to come on this plane. And I think that again comes down to the sense of ownership and freedom that people have got. If I think about, it's a classic example, quoted a lot, but the degree of autonomy that somebody at Southwest Airlines might have in terms of being able to change a booking for somebody, get somebody onto a flight, compared to, the rigmarole that goes through, and that you're trying to make one simple change to a flight in the UK or Europe. It's incredible difference.
But it's amazing how one person can do it and another person can't.
Yeah.
And even within the same airline, I notice a difference, without naming names, between check-in staff and particularly check-in staff and security staff, etc., in Boston compared to London Heathrow, for example. And what you can see is that the process has overwhelmed individuals more, and they don't see the latitude to be able to do something different or to stick their neck out for a customer because they've got a real issue which has caused them to miss their flight or whatever, or be late, etc. And what we've talked about before is the disempowerment of, moving away decision making from even ticketing, taking it away from the desks and pushing it to a call centre. And if we push authority the other way, having worked a lot in change management within organisations, one of the key signs of why does change often fail is because it's too centralised. The design of it is too centralised. The people who are doing the work have not been consulted enough, or we hear this all the time through the sonar that we do, is that their input is only asked at the last minute when a lot of the thinking's been done, and it's about the execution now. And then there's but hang on, there's this issue, this hasn't been considered, how that's going to work. I've seen it across so many different sectors that I've worked in, and it's that real. And interestingly, with the whole, without getting political, the whole Democrat tension after losing the election here, and there was a lot of grassroots Democrats who were saying that one of the reasons they lost was because too much of the decision making about the campaign was at central level, and they weren't going out to the grassroots and listening to what the issues were and what were going to make the difference. And that's where the Republicans did it differently. But they also hooked into and understood from their grassroots what was the best way to communicate with people and to get to them through social media and TikTok and all these different things. So you see it across politics, you see it across almost every sector you come to, is this sense of somehow you need some people at the centre who are more senior. They somehow, through their seniority or through their experience or expertise in some way, or technical experts, somehow are better placed to decide things, even though they are far removed from the work and how it's actually going to impact.
I'm reminded of the story, again, it's a retail example, of a department store in the UK. And it was decided at head office level that there was going to be a change to the design of the shoe department. So think about when you go and try on a pair of shoes where you sit on stools and so forth. And so no consultation with people who are doing at the front line. And the new furniture arrived, and the team in this store took one look at it and said, okay, this isn't going to work. And the reason was that the designers had, again, with the aim of efficiency, and getting more bums on seats, had created a design of the furniture and the seats which meant that people were sitting right next door to each other. And what the people who had that experience of selling shoes for many years knew is when you try on a pair of shoes, you do not want somebody sitting right next door to you. You want space. And it was a perfect example of, hey, what about all of this knowledge that resides in the front line? I think it's often funny that organizations spend thousands, if not millions, on customer research. And who do they not talk to? The people who are experiencing and working with the customers every single day, who have more insight into the customer than any consultant could possibly ever have. So we've talked quite a lot in terms of what the benefits to the business can be and the benefits to the customer. I mean, there's also the element in terms of what difference does it make to leaders? Because we know that one of the challenges in terms of implementing this type of approach is what's in it for me as a leader? After all, we know that traditionally you work your way up through the organization, and as you work your way up, you get more authority and you get more control and more responsibility. So I think the challenge can be, it feels a bit counterintuitive. So I've got to this position and now you're telling me that I'm going to give more control away. Now, I know we don't talk about giving control, giving up control, but that's how it can be seen. What do we think and what have we experienced in terms of the actual benefits for leaders who've implemented this? What does it mean for them? So thinking about it from an individual perspective, what can the benefit be?
Ultimate human behavior from our survival ancestry is about trying to move away from threats. And part of our traditional structure, which is you separate the thinkers from the doers. I remember one of the first questions I was asked in my first professional job was, what do you think you are, a thinker or a doer? Because you decide early on what you are. And I remember thinking, well, I'm both, thanks, which I've maintained throughout my career. So there's this sense, we've gone through the industrial relations, we're post that now. And it's not about, as David Marquet says, you can't just tell people to be creative. A bit like, we used to be, asked to coach people or tell people how that they had to be more confident or they have to challenge more. You have to help, you have to enable that, and you have to help them with what to say and how to say it. But equally, there's this fear of consequences. So if tradition has forced the accountability, and often that rule that there's only one person that can be accountable forces accountability up the way. So the more you progress, the smarter you must be, the more people you have and you lead, and therefore, the different levels of hierarchy and levels of delegated authority, but ultimately somebody is accountable at each level. And that's scary, because if you're holding that, then you're not seeing any ownership around you and everyone's just looking to you. There was quite a insightful time in my early career when I was working in government in some form as a consultant, supporting corporate services function. And essentially with this change management program, we were needing more budget because of issues that were arising. And the director that I reported to, the two of us had to go to see the Director General, and they weren't able to make it. Well, so they were able to make it, but they were late. So I went up ahead, and it was just a real pivotal moment for me, because whilst I had not experience of dealing at that level before, we put a lot of work into the kind of memo that had gone into it in these days. And essentially it's what I was doing then, without using intent, because it wasn't quite as high as intent, it was more recommend. It was essentially walking them up a ladder. And it was very much, this is where we are now, this is what we see, this is what we're hearing, this is what the facts are, not interpretation. This is the implications of that, and this is therefore why we're seeking more budget. And there's a couple of options that go into that. It wasn't necessarily full solution mode, because there was a lot of things that I didn't know, but it was very much, so this is what we're recommending. And just being very honest, but without being problematic. So the can do, not the can't do, which is a slight distinction between being solution, whether you're going with a full solution or not. And it was just really interesting, because they said to me, ultimately they gave the money, they gave the extra budget. Weren't necessarily happy about it, but perfectly amicable. And what they said was, I really appreciate, I've learned something today, and I really feel I understand more about this programme and the issues. Because one of the biggest fears you have in a position like mine is that people tell you what they think you want to hear, or for their career. And I wasn't within the civil servant structure. So there was nowhere, I wasn't going up their career structure. I just all my work is about, I want to have a great impact, but do the right thing. And it was just really pivotal for me, because also the person who had been late arrived, and they were absolutely terrified. And as we were leaving, they were like, "Oh my God, what the hell did you say to them?" This fear, because they used to put a red pen through all my memos, going, "Don't tell them that. Don't tell them that." And whilst obviously I've learned about how you position things, and there's elements of influencing in the level of language, there was fair points there. It was just also that, why can't we just tell them what they need to know to make an informed decision?
So just picking up on that problem solution, there's obviously that old phrase of "don't bring me problems, bring me solutions." Always an element of caution around that, because of course we don't want to end up in that situation where people don't bring and raise the problem for fear of not having the solution in the first instance. So I think one of the roles of leaders is to make it easy for people to come and have the conversation and say, "Hey, here's something I've spotted, and maybe I've thought through what some of the solutions might be, or how we could deal with it." But I think it was Margaret Thatcher who was well known for "don't bring me problems, bring me solutions." Great as an idea in terms of encouraging thinking, challenging if it means the one thing I don't do is to raise an issue if I don't have a solution.
A couple of different responses to that. There's nothing worse than saying to somebody something like, how demoralising if saying, "Don't bring me half-baked ideas, I want a full solution." I've had that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, well, they only become fully baked. So we talk about the difference between red work and blue work. And red work is the doing, and the blue work is the thinking and the decision and the evaluating. And it's like, well, you can't develop half-baked unless you have conversations about improvement and discussions, and not just focusing on tasks. So it's the most demoralizing thing you can say to someone. And then, of course, they'll retrench and then they'll go backwards and they'll not give you anything. It's that balance of, and I think it's the difference between solutions with share the information you have and the implications as you see them, and some possible options, or take as much as you can. Because I remember there's been various times in my career where I've noticed where maybe I've been allowed to do certain things, and it can be even as simple as travel. I suppose even flying on a plane as opposed to going to driving or going on the train or whatever. And it's often because I provide the information to the person who needs to make the decision. I don't leave. So there's nothing worse. And we talked about that in our teams when people are newer, is just reminding them that, if you're asking, don't ask my permission, give your intent with the information to make it really easy for me to make a quick decision. Because if you're research your options, give us the costs or whatever, because otherwise I'm going to have to do all of that and I'm supposed to be evaluating. So it's rather than think about it, how do you make it easy and effortless for your leader to say, great, go ahead. And if you don't provide enough information, they're not going to be doing that. And I've often heard people who've been considered to be quite scary leaders. They have been possibly in the way they spoke to people or but they were actually, I've seen some really great leaders in the sense that whilst they could have worked on their language skills and to make people feel psychologically safe in some respects, they would always say to them, I will have your back. I will always have your back if there's no surprises. And sometimes things can happen and they are a surprise. But if you knew before and you didn't tell me and you didn't give me time to either delay something or notify the board or whatever it is, it's difficult for me to have your back. So no surprises. I think that, how would you make the distinction, Pete, against the whole, but what's the balance between, can you never, if you can take a solution, great. And you might be of the experience level.
To me, the key thing is the short, early conversation. That's the key mechanism.
Yeah.
Do not hold back from sharing something that you need to communicate. Even if it's, I've spotted a potential problem, I'm working on it. That's the most important thing. No surprises.
We always talk about share the information, not the instruction. Share the information and the implications and the impact. Take it as far as you can. And obviously, as you develop your clarity and competence, the more you'll be able to get it to an intent with a full solution. How do you know you're being told you're getting the right information? How do you know that you've got the right insight to make the right decisions? And the only way to do that is to go out and share the goal, share the problem, and bring in the thinking.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting in terms of, from that leader's perspective, was a sense of, how do I know what I don't know and what's being blocked from me? And I'm reminded about a conversation I had recently, and I'm happy to name because I've been on a stage with this guy. His name's Jim Cross. He's one of the senior leaders in National Grid, who are the big suppliers of gas into New York. And Jim said a couple of things to me recently. Firstly, he said, I'm the man who is known as hating consultants. And here we are 2.5 years in our relationship. And I think one of the reasons that his perspective has changed, he said to me, what I've realized is the more control I give, the more I'm in control. And it sounds like a bit of a riddle, but I'm reminded a bit of the great animation and the story of the Santa Fe, where David Marquet talks about, suddenly, instead of the captain making all the decisions, I've got 134 engaged, passionate team members. And what Jim was saying was exactly the same, is suddenly it had gone from him being effectively making all of the decisions, making all of the calls, and effectively directing people of what to do. And now he had a team who was solving problems, who were spotting things in advance, who were doing the thinking. And as a result, actually, you achieve more predictability in terms of performance than if you rely on the traditional strong leader mechanism. So in some senses, there's a kind of contradiction when we think about that idea of a strong leader. Actually, an organization that relies on a strong leader becomes exceptionally fragile if that leader is not there. So for me, I think one of the big benefits of this idea of pushing authority to information is it makes my life easier, because I've now got a team who are all active thinking rather than everything coming back to me. And now, instead of having my head down in the detail, I can stand on my tiptoes and look and think about, what am I seeing overall here? What are the patterns that I'm seeing? And what am I seeing in terms of the big picture?
But interesting, you gave good examples the other day, and I think it'd be useful to talk about what's the difference between intent-based leadership and, say, mission command or servant leadership. But before we get to that, you gave a very good example the other day of hearing intent used incorrectly, because intent has to be towards, in submarine terms, it was towards the what was the mission and what was all your attempts to progress, to make progress against that. And it's the same here, is in terms of to progress within your project or your overall business goals, whatever it is. You heard intent the other day, and it was quite interesting to think, that's not. And it comes from the coaching world of you coach, you set goals, you agree actions, you just explain a little bit more. It was very
So what I noticed with this particular team is that they were very interested in intent-based leadership, but their first attempt to use it, their intent was what I would describe as kind of medium to long-term goals, and more of the type of things that are kind of wish lists. I want to spend more money on training and development. I want to be better in terms of articulating goals, all of which are very worthy and important things. But I think the key thing and how we're now helping that team is to think, well, intent is largely something which is about decisions which are going to happen. Now, of course, that has to sit within the broader framework of what are we trying to achieve. And actually, the reference to mission command is helpful there, because there's a very clear link, but also a very clear distinction. So the two are very strongly related. So mission command for me is about the leader setting the overall intent, and intent-based leadership then provides how do we actually do this as a team? So the two sit very closely together. But if you only adopt mission command, then actually what you leave, I think, often is a team not clear about, how do we actually go about doing this? And are we used to making decisions for ourselves? And critically, for me, the whole value in terms of sharing intent is it's a mechanism for inviting feedback between and within a team. So I think there's a very strong relationship between mission command and intent-based leadership, but they are different. And we need to be really clear about that. Intent-based leadership, as emerged from the Santa Fe, is a specific mechanism for leaders and teams working and talking together. Mission command is a more strategic proposition, which says the mission commander sets the overall objectives and then leaves the team to decide.
So then, does that mean that, for those who ask this question a lot, does this mean that we're talking about getting rid of, so mission command is very much, you're saying it more of a strategic or mission level rather than at the more operational level? But let's clarify for people, does intent-based leadership mean no hierarchy?
That's a great question. Yeah, so I think there's often a confusion, maybe, which is, intent-based leadership is all about pushing authority to information. And therefore, the best way to do that is to have a flat team and a flat organization. That's not what we believe. We believe that actually hierarchy has its place because it provides a structure for clarity in terms of how decisions are made, who is making the decisions, and how information is aligned and how the mission is aligned to what teams are trying to achieve. The challenge with a flat organization is, where does the clarity come from? And I think the example that David is often used is, in a flat organization, you end up with the equivalent of a stagnant pond. What you want is the equivalent of a gently flowing river in which information is moving both ways. And so it's not too much coming top down. Information can move both ways. But for me, and I do experience this quite a lot, there's a sense of people still need to make decisions. So one of the myths I think that can be developed with intent-based leadership is, we all get to have a say in this. I didn't like this, so they can't be operating as an IBL leader. For me, I think we need to go back to the basic.
Or I didn't get my way, so you're controlling. You're very controlling.
Yeah. Whereas the reality is that for me, the value of the approach is I make a better decision because I've got insight from the team, or the decision is better because the team are able to make, or a team member is now able to make that decision.
And I think that's the key, because it's very difficult to run anything through consensus. And consensus ultimately leads to compromise. Ultimately, you're trying to get to use that awful cliche, win-win. But essentially, you're trying to meet all the needs as much as possible, but you have to prioritize, and you have to have a sense of, well, hang on, what's the criteria we're going to apply here? What's the goal? What are we trying to achieve? And what's the criteria, the decision criteria that we need to apply to make sure that whatever we do in terms of what we do, the what and the how, which often is about how do we approach this? How do we execute this? What does a great plan look like? Is what does it need to, what are the key boxes it needs to tick off? And so often there can be resistance from that within teams, because that's seen as, being prescriptive, but it's not, because that's not telling them how to do it. It's telling them these are the parameters you need to consider, or what Americans call the guardrails. That when we're assessing, or when you're coming and giving your intent, you're not just giving your intent, you're also stating your why and your criteria based on, well, this is what I see and know, and this is why I intend to do this, because it meets these criteria. And the power of that, of course, is because therefore when we talk about the traditional leader becomes the evaluator, the decision evaluator, they're essentially saying, as long, they're asking probing questions too, and open questions to understand, well, what's telling you that? And what criteria have you applied to that? Or equally, it could be, it sounds to me as though you're missing a vital piece of information. Let me share that with you now. How does that influence your intent, etc.? It's like, it's just as much a conversation. The psychological ownership someone gets, because ultimately, if the evaluator says, great, go ahead, they haven't really made the decision, the evaluator. They've said, go ahead to it. The person who did the thinking and has the psychological ownership of it is the individual who gave the intent. And what we practice is, and it's not just about sitting singly and deciding often what your intent is, it's who do you have to go and discuss who's also close to the work or has a different vantage point, or you impact them in some way. Your output may be an input to them, or the other way around. So you have to come and say who you've consulted, what's informed, what's told you that this is an informed intent. Just so it's helpful, because we hear people talking about, this intent-based leadership is very like servant leadership. It's very people-focused, isn't it? It's very like servant leadership. And I suppose the mountain analogy is quite a good.
Yeah, so the one where if you're climbing a mountain, or you have a team climbing a mountain, the servant leader is effectively, what can I carry for it so that everybody else can progress? Mm-hmm. Whereas the intent-based leader sits down with the team and works out, what are we trying to achieve and what might be the best way to get there? Mm-hmm. And what is everybody going to do to contribute towards that?
So quite different.
Quite different.
Not carrying their bags for them.
No, absolutely not.
So again, but just the final thing I was going to say to that was, and also it sometimes can be that you're asking the team to give intent, not one individual, or you're trying to get to a team, say, we're within a meeting. And it's this, people have to understand that somebody still has to draw the line, but it's a lot easier to draw the line if you've had a full discussion about, because it's not about how smart you are, it's about what's your vantage point. And everybody has different vantage points to which they will know and see and hear different things from different stakeholders, customers. They can see on a day-to-day basis the different issues at play. You are about trying to get on the table what everybody sees from their vantage point, and then using the core goal and clear criteria, agreeing and often certifying the criteria with the team. And what we mean by that is, don't tell them what the criteria is, try and pull it from them and then top up on what they might be missing, because you have a lot more understanding of how much clarity they have. And it's a learning opportunity. It's a lot easier then to draw the line and say, okay, so we've listened to all of this, but we're going down this route because that's what meets these criteria. It makes it a lot easier for people who've been consulted but are not necessarily getting their way to buy into it, because there's a clear why. Because how often I see it in voluntary things that I do, in schools, and see it across so many aspects of life. And I sometimes think we're getting worse as a society. I notice it more and more, is that people think they can just tell you the what or the how or both. But somehow you understanding the why doesn't matter. And I know from my brain working is, if I get told what to do with no why, it's very difficult for me to engage. And also, I don't remember things either. If I understand the why and the criteria, it's locked in there. And it's amazing how many conversations and meetings that we observe and watching it and think, yeah, I can hear the what and I can hear the how, but I'm not hearing the why. And I'm not sure of the goal. And I'm not sure of the decision criteria. They're hidden in the conversation and it's not obvious to people because there's no structure to that conversation. And intent-based leadership brings you a structure to have conversations and a language in which to have it.
So I think these are all things that we want to explore in future sessions in particular. Moving towards a close, we talked about all of the benefits, whether that's at organization, customer, leader level. If it's so obvious, why do we think companies find it either hard to do or choose not to do it, choose not to take this approach?
Because it's a lot easier. Just change is tough for people. And, if you look at a lot of research on personality profiles, or whether you want to buy into all of that or not, because people can behave or have different preferences in different contexts. The point is more people generally than not don't like change. But it's also the sense of sometimes seeing things like somehow if we have to change, it's an all or nothing. And what we talk so much about and what we do is it's just see it as a set of experiments. Go practice and see what you get back. And if you look at all the neuroscience learning about how our brains work, of build new pathways, they become little paths to start off with as you try new things. But the more you do it and do it and do it, the more it becomes a freeway or a motorway to the UK. And that becomes the path of least resistance now. But you have to practice. It doesn't happen overnight. And it's sometimes when you start with, you might find Leader Speaks Last, for example, is a practice that we talk about. And not meaning that leaders don't speak at all. It means they don't speak their opinions. They don't anchor their opinions first. That can be difficult if the first time they try it, they don't get much back. But then they have to ask themselves, well, what was causing me not to get something back? And what's getting in the way? Is this because the team are fearful of looking bad, or they don't know how much clarity do they have? And ultimately, it just becomes that sense of, what do I need to do differently? Have I set up why I'm doing it? Or have I just made it look like they're like, what suddenly happened? It's like bunnies in headlights. You have to be clear on your intent to be intent-based leader. You have to give clear intent to your team about where you're moving in order to help and enable them to move. Yeah. So you don't give up after the first one. You learn and you think, what didn't work, or what is it I haven't put in place to enable them to make more, which is where all the other practices come, the other principles come in, because you can't just obviously do push authority on its own. That's for another podcast, I imagine.
Indeed. I mean, I think there's a kind of step before that, maybe, is probably what I went through as a leader. So when I was the CEO of Investors and People in Scotland, firstly, there was a very high expectation. Everybody who worked there thought this is going to be a great place to work because it's investors and people. And I really would reflect that I tried to do everything that I thought the traditional leader should do. And I did have that, it was literal, no, it was more metaphorical, light bulb moment when I picked up Turn the Ship Around and thought, this changes everything for me in terms of thinking about what leadership means and who leaders are. And it suddenly helped me understand why all of the good efforts that we'd been making were pretty short term. And summed up, I remember it so clearly, sitting in a boardroom on an offsite, looking at a report. I think it was probably a report on our own organisation. Somebody, and it was probably me, saying, why can't we get them to think like us? And so I do think that part of the challenge is that for most organisations, we're still stuck in the traditional industrial age of there are principally leaders who decide and there are mostly people who do. Now, I'd also hazard a guess that, and I have tried to find this on AI, but ChatGPT has been challenged by this. I suspect that if you look at most corporate documents, business plans, somewhere in the people section, there will be reference to, we believe that it's important. First of all, we believe that our people are our greatest asset, which actually came from the slave trade, ironically. Therefore, we need to empower them. But the problem is that organizations don't have the methodology and the how. And I think the great thing about intent-based leadership is it provides the very practical structures and frameworks and language that allow leaders to genuinely start giving people more control. Often, I think what goes wrong in organizations is that people hear, we're going to empower you to make whatever decision you think is right for the customer. Sounds good. I've just signed a contract and I gave the customer a 25% discount. What? I gave them a discount. Well, why would you do that? Well, because you told me that I was empowered to do anything that I thought was right for the customer. Yeah, but I didn't think you were going to do that. Oh, okay. Well, next time you make the decision. And so it falls flat because there's an absence of structure.
And also, well, in that situation, the ladder of leadership, that's a level 6.
Yes.
David Marquet's good phrase is level 6, too late to fix.
And again, we will return to that at a future podcast where we'll talk about this idea or what the apparent quandary of, do I ask permission or do I just act and seek forgiveness? And what's the better way?
But essentially, it's understanding that intent-based leadership, it's about creating that safety net where you create these thinking individuals where you're not just trying to lead them through extrinsic motivators, through processes and controls and consequences and threats and measures and all the things that are coming at them. You're trying to release their motivation from within. And one of these, some of our core intrinsic motivations are around having clarity and some degrees of certainty and having a sense of agency and control and autonomy, feeling impactful. So in giving intent as a safety net, because there's still the opportunity to say, whoa, no, hang on, you're missing information there.
Again, I think this is a great subject for a future podcast, is how intrinsic motivation underpins the whole approach to intent-based leadership. Let's bring things to a close by thinking about what's the first steps. If we want to go down this route of pushing authority to information, what needs to happen? I'll go with you, Nick, first, and then I'll draw back and think about some of the structure that we can put in place.
Well, I guess you can look at it at a micro level first, although ultimately, if it's not being modelled at the top of the organisation who isn't putting in the mechanisms in place to enable that behaviour, to enable people to feel as though their input will be valued and not pushed back, or it won't affect the perception of them. If that's not modelled and there's not mechanisms to do that, then people will retrench, and whatever you do, you can throw as many training things you want at people. If you don't establish and understand what stops people speaking up, what's stopping people taking more initiative, it's often to do with fear of consequences.
I'm reminded of the worst workshop I ever had. And I'm not going to obviously name names at all, but the challenge was that the team just did not see the leaders practicing this.
No, well,
and literally refused to engage and said, "We're not going to do it until we see X, Y, and Z doing this. We're not interested." The
approach has evolved so much, bringing on board your previous chief executive roles, my previous change management and coaching roles, and being a leadership partner, etc. But we don't want to work with clients who think that it's about everybody else who needs to change other than them, or that somehow you can just, these practices, yes, an individual leader can try a lot of these things and it can make real traction. So if we go down to the micro level, you want to start small, start trying to push people up that ladder that we call it, from observations into
invite people up the ladder.
Invite people up the ladder using observations, encouraging them to share their observations. Then they're in thinking, moving them into, well, what does this mean? What are the options before giving intent? You don't just jump them to intent. That's just too big a leap. So you start small and you start in low risk operational areas. And I think that's the other thing. It's not about saying to everybody, you're now involved in strategic, or you're working over here in engineering and we want you now to make decisions about our marketing. It's about the work and the work they're close to. It's about the operational work. and you start small and you build their confidence up, but you're also tuning other practices you come into, because you're beginning to learn, what do they know and what do they not know? What's their levels of comfort, and how do I keep pushing them forward? Now, you can make headway, of course you can, with these as a leader. However, when it gets into bigger stuff where there's wider factors in the environment that's causing people to, or impacting performance, or where people are not working in the way that's required, there's things that are happening out there that are causing that, often in terms of how they're measured, things in the environment, messages coming from different leaders. There's a whole host of things. Or when things go wrong, we get punished in some way.
Yeah, I agree.
It can't ignore the organizational leadership piece.
No, I think there are two dimensions to me. The first is, what can I start to do as a leader? Because ultimately, the only person you can control is yourself. And so I think the starting point is, what do I choose to do? And of course, there is lots of information, whether that's the Turn the Ship Around book, Leadership is Language, or the nudges which are available, all of which can help. So there's that cliche phrase, be the change that you want to see in other people. So I think there's something that you can do at individual level. I'm remembering an example from a football club, actually, one close to your heart, I think, Nick, in Scotland.
Sorry, don't associate me with what I think you're about to associate with me.
No, this was with one of the Edinburgh clubs, and they, at the academy level, they started to use some of the practices of intent-based leadership. And so it wasn't being driven by the overall leaders within the club, but they tried it at a local level, at the academy level. And the really neat example was that the way in which they structured their training was that each week the head of the academy would decide, or the leadership team of the academy would decide, this is the priority for this week. So this week, everybody, each coach is going to work with their teams on offside, for example. And then the edict went out, whether you are an under 18 coach or an under 11 coach, this week is all about offside. And then they realized that actually that bore no relation to the actual performance on the pitch. So what they said to the coaches was, we're going to give you the responsibility to decide what the training priorities are for your team for next week, for each week, based on what you've seen happening in the team. Really, really simple idea. Let's move it forward. Let's just give it a little bit of responsibility and start practicing.
Well, we saw that, we've seen that in schools as well, and where teachers, to get more focus from the kids, will invite them to shape some of their day. So they'll say, okay, so this is what we're trying to achieve today, and this is some things we have to do at the beginning and the end, but here's your choices. You decide how we're going to present, the order in which we're going to do it. And it hones their focus in, and it makes them feel they're not being done to and spoken at, and it's just, we're just in class to sit in.
Yeah, that's a great example where the same teacher's teaching the class through the day. So why not give some freedom or give some control to the pupils in terms of deciding the order of the lessons?
But remember, not as well, there was, having read aspects of the book about ASDA.
ASDA Magic by David Smith.
And part of that was pushing, there was good examples, and this is going years back, Asda being a large supermarket chain in the United Kingdom. And it was, I remember talking to some leaders when I was in retail, a different retailer, but that sense of, so what stops? There's a whole issue around scheduling and rotas, and people feel done to and annoyed that they can't get their day off here because of someone else, or for an important event or a critical appointment or whatever it is. And so actually one of the examples was about, okay, so give it to the team to work out the rota and the schedule. And it's amazing how they will begin to have one another's back. Well, if you do that, this is the trade-off. Well, if you do this, I'll do this for you. If you do this, I'll do this for you. And things get solved. Does the first time it happen, maybe is it quicker? No, of course it won't be, because there'll be lots of things to learn and factor in. You don't give up. You keep going, and then you're asking them, what's a better way of doing it the next time? How can we improve the conversation, or how do we do it? How can I help? But that whole, and the classic examples of, when you talk to customers, my biggest thing, and I'm not going to, because this was prior to my work in intent-based leadership, But I'll never forget the work I used to do in dealerships, and when we would look at
In
sort of
car dealerships, just for clarity.
car dealerships, and brand through people. And I would do a lot of interviewing with customers, sometimes by video link, sometimes in the room with them. Other people would be watching. And in these dealerships, there was there was the sales with the smart suits and the, getting all the commission for the sales. And then there was the after sales team. And then there was a kind of another factor there, which was, probably the least paid jobs, which were the valeters who cleaned the cars and did the washing, whatever. And it was always sort of considered, there was a kind of hierarchy of sales, after sales. But when you talk to the customers about what made the difference to them, often it was the conversations they had with the valeters or the nice things they did for them because they knew they liked X, Y, and Z to make sure that that's what they got as their gift, or not necessarily the flowers in the back of the car, or it might have been the driver jacket, or all these different things. But they also knew they liked skiing. They knew they would give insight back to the after sales team about the fact that might be needing some snow tires, things like that. And watching the room as customers started to talk about the valeters and the after sales, and quite naturally these people saying, so how is it they get all the commission then? Because you're selling up front, but when they come back in the door the next time to buy, that's because of us. That's because of us. And that causes that whole issue of how people are measured and monitored, and how you make it fair in terms of, but that was watching the confidence of these valeters as they heard customers talking about their virtues was something I will never forget, and watching everyone else in the room kind of like.
So I think the overall message is that we can start, there's nothing that stops us trying to use the simple practices of intent-based leadership. At an organization and team level, what we would recommend is looking at the 6 principles and thinking about them as the basis of a planning approach. And our intent with these podcasts is to work through those different principles and to talk about how they interlink. So, for example, if we want to push authority to information, that means that we have to tune control based on levels of competence and clarity. We have to understand what level of psychological safety needs to be in place for people to make decisions, to be comfortable to learn, to be comfortable to speak up. And we have to understand, how do you build an environment in which people are not just able to make better decisions, but also do so with a mindset of what are we learning and how are we improving? So over the course of our future podcasts, we will be going into more detail on that. But I think this is a point to wrap things up for now, Nick. So thank you very much for getting us off to a good debut start. See you soon.